Hello, everyone. Glad you could join us today. My name is Dan Wicklum, and I'm the CEO of the Transition Accelerator. The run of show for today's meeting is I will start with some housekeeping and a bit of background. Then we'll turn it over to Mayor Alana Nachiu, who's the Mayor of Sturgeon County, for some opening strategic remarks. But the bulk of the seminar today will be handled by Dr. David Layzell, who's a Transition Accelerator energy systems architect and a prof at the University of Calgary. And I'll just say up front, basically everything that we've done in hydrogen at the accelerator and the Edmonton Hydrogen HUB really is because of, I would say, the intellectual capacity and drive and motivation of Dave. He's been working in this file for about 4 years, going back to when it was actually quite lonely. And now the world seems to be focusing on hydrogen. But Dave is basically the reason why we have this hydrogen hub. In Dave's presentation, he'll give about 45 minutes of a talk, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for Q&As at the end. So in terms of just some housekeeping around that, we're going to have both the chat line open today. And we encourage people to use that. So that's for back and forth conversation among all the webinar participants. We've disabled the cameras and the microphones for people. There's just too many people to allow that to happen. We had almost 700 people registered. So even if half show up, it becomes an unwieldy number to allow people to speak. But please do use the chat session to engage back and forth. And we've also enabled the Q&A section as well. So please put in questions into the Q&A section, not the chat section, into the Q&A session. And of course, in Zoom, there's a voting function. So if you see a question that you like, please vote yes for it. That will trickle to the top of the Q&A list. So after Dave's 45-minute presentation, when I select from the list of questions for Dave to ask, we will already have them ranked. So please vote. And this is not like an election that the mayor runs in. You can vote as many times as you want for those questions. So please do that. We'll just say that we are recording this, and the recording is going to be available on the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB website. And Dr. Layzell has also agreed to share the presentation. So I'll also post a copy of the presentation on the website. The last thing I'll say just for housekeeping here is that all of this work is very aligned with the National Hydrogen Strategy for Canada that NRCan has made, and also the ongoing Alberta Hydrogen Roadmap development that we at the Hub and the Accelerator have had the great opportunity to feed into and shape both of those documents. So before I get into any more background in terms of setting context for the technical part of today's event, Mayor, I'll turn to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning. My name is Alana Nachiu. I'm Mayor of Sturgeon County, Alberta. I'm chair of the Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association and chair of the leadership team of the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB, as well as a member of the HUB working group with Natural Resource Canada. Thank you very much for all of you who are joining us here today to learn more about what the Edmonton Hydrogen HUB is proposing to accelerate the build out of a hydrogen economy in the Edmonton region. The Hub has developed a new process known as Base Case that will accelerate a domestic export market of $100 billion a year. The Base Case incorporates a market sounding approach, which provides an opportunity for industry to contribute to the how the hydrogen economy can be accelerated. So practically, this means that the development of the hydrogen economy and its supporting infrastructure will help us to maintain jobs as well as create new ones. As the world rapidly moves towards a low carbon future to address climate change, governments and industry are turning towards hydrogen, as it is internationally recognized as the fuel of choice to decarbonize heavy freight, shipping, off-road vehicles, planes, trains, space heating in cold climates, and can also be used as low carbon feedstock for industry. So hydrogen is redefining how we use our natural resources, and I am proud to say that my colleagues and I at the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB are working together to advance a shared goal of accelerating a strong pan-Canadian hydrogen economy and working towards a goal of making Canada a leading user and exporter of low carbon hydrogen. So since the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB launched in April of this year, significant progress has already been made towards establishing a hydrogen economy in our region, with Suncor and ATCO partnering on a hydrogen project, as well as the Government of Canada announcing funding for a hydrogen fueling station for buses and heavy haul transport just last week. And then as well, the announcement that Air Products will build a $1.3 billion hydrogen facility in the city of Edmonton. We are proud to have created a framework and an environment where government and industry can build on the work and research that has been done by the Transition Accelerator and other hub members to come together to accelerate our region's clean energy future. The faster Alberta and Canada can develop a platform and get into the game, the sooner we can plan a secure, competitive future for our economy that makes our natural resources more sustainable than ever before. But we know why here and why the Edmonton region. As we've heard before, there's the three basic reasons of geology, geography, and skill set. Our geology lends itself to the carbon capture. Our geography has positioned us with access to low-cost natural gas, and our experience in oil and gas gives us a head start in both infrastructure and expertise. We are already home to Western Canada's first hydrogen blending project, with clean burning gas being added into the residential natural gas supply to lower overall emissions from home heating. And we have the production and distribution infrastructure and the industry expertise to scale it up to Canadian-wide energy system. So yes, there is a strong case for hydrogen, a case that involves the economy, the environment, and the quality of life we want to secure for Alberta's future. And I'm looking forward to hearing from this morning's team of experts on the base case. So back to you, Dan and David. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So before we turn to Dave to start his technical presentation, I'll just add a little bit of context here, some history. So recall that the hub was launched on April the 14th. So the hub's been around for about 2 months. It was launched again with the 4 levels of government. And really what the hub is here for is to answer the question, how do we accelerate the implementation of a self-sustaining hydrogen economy so that we can benefit from this remarkable potential upside, but also have the environmental and social benefits as well. So there's no question that we could simply let a hydrogen economy unfold. And over time, the years and the decades that would happen, this is about acceleration. This is about how can we jump steps. This is about how can we take what would happen in 10 years to happen in 1, because we are in a global race, especially for the economic upside. So in the 2 months since the hub has been launched, led by Dave, but with the input from all of the hub participants, including the 4 levels of government, including Alberta Industrial Heartland Association, Edmonton Global, University of Calgary, University of Alberta, what they've developed is a base case model. And the concept of a base case is essentially saying, instead of just letting economy appear 1 step at a time, we should have an understanding of how a value chain, what a value chain could look like in the future so that we can jump steps and accelerate implementation. So this concept of a base case is really what Dave's talking about here. And the base case is a combination of principles to follow about how the private sector and the public sector could partner in terms of building out a self-sustaining hydrogen economy. And it's also about some very specific technical insights about this specific area, where hydrogen could be used, how it could be transported, and the pros and cons of each. So what we're really trying to do is create a base case value chain in general that could be used across the country, but specifically calibrated to the Edmonton area. And just so you know, next steps for the hub is being clear on how more entities, more people can plug into, influence the development of this base case, and potentially find ways for their companies to launch projects and build onto and be part of rolling out this value chain. So I'm going to stop there, Dave, and throw it over to you. So remember, questions in the Q&A session, please vote for them, and we'll start questions in 45 minutes after Dave is done. Dave?
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now and start a presentation. It's a real pleasure, and I appreciate the comments of both Mayor Nachu and Dan, thank you. I'd like to also recognize a number of individuals who I've been working with, some over the last few years and some over the last 6 months, to develop many of the ideas and do a lot of the techno-economic analysis behind some of the things I'll be talking about today. I'd like to begin by just a word or two about hydrogen, why we're talking about hydrogen. I think we all know that Canada, the United States, and dozens of other countries have committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And in the Transition Accelerator for the last 2.5 years or so, we've been trying to identify how Canada can win in transition to net zero, and what are the best transition pathways. So when you look at the net zero emissions, and you look at the emissions we have in our existing energy system, it's pretty clear that a lot of the emissions, in fact, the majority of the emissions, are coming from end-use carbon-based end-use carriers like natural gas, gasoline, diesel, etc. And it's pretty clear that in a net zero future, it's going to be very challenging to continue to burn these kinds of energy carriers, putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere distributed across Canada. So we are going to have to change those energy carriers. The world is rapidly coming to a consensus that a net zero energy system will look something like a diagram on the right-hand side of this chart. A significant increase in the role of electricity as an end-use energy carriers, and an increased role for biomass, perhaps. But the new one is an energy carrier that doesn't contain carbon. And that's hydrogen is that energy carrier. And these energy carriers, both electricity and hydrogen, have to be made with minimal or no greenhouse gas emissions. So why hydrogen? Well, some sectors need chemical, not electrical energy carriers. And Mayor Nachu mentioned some of these: freight transportation, heavy industry like steel making, et cetera, and space heating in cold regions and large buildings. Now, often it's positioned that hydrogen and electricity are competing with each other for market share. And I would argue it's not that at all. What it is hydrogen and electricity complement each other, because you can make hydrogen from electricity, and you can make electricity from hydrogen by splitting water or putting it back together again, if you like, by combusting the hydrogen. And hydrogen can also be very valuable long-term storage for energy that is a carbon containing energy store. Another benefit of hydrogen is that it actually can enhance your biofuel production and your productivity of biofuel production that you get from lignocellulosic biomass, for example. So what I'd like to do then is move on and talk about how we make hydrogen, how we make it today, and how we envisage it being made in a new fuel hydrogen future. Today, we make actually in Canada about 8,200 tons of hydrogen a day. It's made from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas. The carbon is released into the atmosphere, and the hydrogen is used as an industrial feedstock. It's used to make fertilizer for agriculture. It's used to make fuels for transportation. It's used to crack bitumen into synthetic crude oil and to convert various kinds of crude oil into gasoline and diesel. It's used to make materials and chemicals. And we produce a lot of hydrogen in Canada, but actually especially in Alberta. In this new net zero energy system, we still envisage producing hydrogen, and hydrogen can produce from a number of different sources, as long as the production of that hydrogen has very low or zero greenhouse gas emissions. We can produce it from fossil fuels and biomass, but instead of releasing the carbon into the atmosphere, as happens over here, and this is called gray hydrogen, in a zero emission future, we envisage capturing that CO2 and sequestering it. And of course, if the carbon is made from fossil fuels, you can make it with very low emissions. If the hydrogen is made from biomass, CO2 sequestration can actually give you negative carbon emission hydrogen. It can also be made from renewables or nuclear energy, electricity, by splitting water, electrolysis of water to make hydrogen. And there are some chemical plants around Canada, mostly in the chlor-alkali area, making sodium hydroxide, that produce hydrogen as a byproduct. These would not only provide industrial feedstocks, but also provide export opportunities for Canada and hydrogen fuels to support transportation, buildings, and industry. And indeed, the hydrogen can be converted back into electricity. So you can see the hydrogen in this case would be kind of a storage, long-term storage for electrical energy, perhaps seasonal storage. So Canada is actually very lucky because we're one of the world's lowest cost producers of blue and green hydrogen. And this has been recognized by a number of countries of the world who've looked around and said, where do we get hydrogen? And a Japanese study a few years ago, identified Canada as one of the lowest cost places in the world to make hydrogen. And in fact, Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan can make hydrogen at around $10 a gigajoule as blue hydrogen, and can make green hydrogen the lowest of all the countries in green hydrogen, because we have low cost electricity from renewables in places like Quebec and Manitoba. If you look at the price here, is we can actually make hydrogen in Alberta at about half the wholesale cost of diesel, about 1/3 the retail cost of diesel on an energy use basis. And this opens up a very interesting opportunity, an exciting opportunity for Alberta, in particular in Western Canada, to get into the business of making hydrogen that would actually displace the diesel market. And indeed, the cost of green hydrogen production is coming down rapidly, and it will soon, in many parts of Canada, be able to compete very effectively against diesel at the wholesale and retail cost. So we know that Canada has low-cost blue and green hydrogen, but what about its environmental footprint? And when you do the life cycle intensity of blue hydrogen production, so in other words, produced from fossil fuels and with carbon capture and storage, the life cycle intensity, this includes upstream emissions associated with getting the natural gas out of the ground, the methane emissions that sometimes occur. It's about 3 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. Hopefully this will come down with more regulation on the emissions of methane with natural gas extraction. On the green hydrogen, when you look at the whole life cycle of renewable production, et cetera, from hydropower plants or from wind or solar, the life cycle emissions are gained in the range of about 0.8 to 3 kilograms. Whether it's green or blue hydrogen, when they're used to displace, for example, diesel or gasoline in transportation, one sees a reduction in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in the 80 to 95% range. And when it's used to displace, say, natural gas in building or in industry as a heat source, it reduces emissions by 67 to 90%. So these are well on the way on a transition pathway. Hydrogen from either sources are well on a transition path to net zero energy systems. So what we could ask is, what markets for hydrogen are most promising? Well, in order to understand that, we want to have in this chart, you can see the amount, what Canadians currently pay for our chemical energy sources. So we see here the range for natural gas that's used in heating, the range of wholesale prices for natural gas and retail prices in various parts of Canada. We're lucky in Alberta, our wholesale prices are down here. Places like Nova Scotia, it's quite a bit higher. And the retail prices, of course, go higher than that. In diesel transportation, of using diesel as a transportation fuel, wholesale prices in this range in retail. So it's pretty clear that we value in our economy, transportation fuels have a higher, on an energy use basis, value than heat. When you actually look at the cost of blue and green hydrogen production today, what we see is they're much more in line with, they're higher than what we're going to be paying for natural gas, of course, as a heat source, but there's a potential to meet the wholesale and retail markets for diesel fuel. So in the transition to a net zero hydrogen economy, freight transportation currently holds the most promise to be economically viable in the short to medium term, especially if we can introduce hydrogen very efficiently into our economy. However, I think it's also important to recognize, when you're thinking about a transition to a net zero energy system, that we need a solution for our heat sources, our sources of heat energy within our economy. As you can see in some of the data present, these are very large sources of emissions and large amounts of energy use. And hydrogen is likely to play a very important role there as well. And we must think about the design of our energy system in the next 5 or 10 years to make sure that it can also meet needs for heat, both in space heating and industrial heating. So let's just talk briefly about the magnitude of the challenge and the opportunity in Canada. And this is just one chart I'd like to show. And what you see here is an estimate of the fuel hydrogen market potential in Canada. So this is the use of hydrogen as an energy carrier to provide transportation and space heating, et cetera, industrial heat and power. And so some calculations that we've done is suggest that this is the current amount of hydrogen that's produced in Canada, not as a fuel, but as an industrial feedstock. It's about 8,000 tons of hydrogen per day. The estimate in the diesel market across Canada, if 80% of this is only 2017 numbers, presumably the demand for fuel, for transportation fuel, will increase in the next 30 years, but just in the 2017 numbers, we're based on about 16 or so thousand tons of hydrogen a day if 80% of the diesel market was met with hydrogen. 30% of the gasoline market is an estimate there, and the natural gas market for both the space and industrial heating. So we're looking here domestically across Canada of approaching 60,000 tons of hydrogen per day. In Alberta, which is a major energy user as well, it's around 20,000 tons of hydrogen per day. On top of this, we have potential export markets. These are countries like South Korea have come out and said they're interested in importing from other nations. South Korea, about 14,000 tons a day by 2040. Japan has recently come up and said about 8,200 tons a day. Germany, about 7,000 tons a day. And the United States, theoretically could be as much as 57,000 tons a day. That would be a potential market opportunity for Canada to sell into those markets. Overall, here we're seeing a potential wholesale market of over $100 billion per year. So with all those good, promising things about hydrogen, I think it's really important to recognize the problem with hydrogen as a fuel. And I think this really is going to influence how we approach developing a net zero energy system and our focus on the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB. The problem with hydrogen is it's a gas, and therefore it's a lot more difficult to move and store than liquids, especially if you try to do it in relatively small quantities. So the take-home message here is go big or go home. We have to get to scale. And if we don't get to scale, it's very difficult to make the economics work. So what we must do with building hubs across Canada, and we're looking at Edmonton as an early place to start, is to focus on places where we have low cost, bringing together three things: low cost waste, blue and green hydrogen, identify substantial nearby markets for that hydrogen, especially in the transport market, which should be economically viable sooner, but also in the heating fuel market, where it can provide some valuable backup for transportation, as we will talk about. And we also need the ability to connect the two. Ideally, as you'll see, we're seeing pipelines as being the place where we need to go, but perhaps in the early stages, we can't quite get there. And then fourth is we need a scale of supply and demand where the economics works without sustained public investment. And of course, to bring all this together, we need engaged industry, we need engaged governments and academics. So what we must create is a new self-sustaining value chain that brings all of these together, that connects the supply to the demand. So this is an example of a value chain. And there's some very principles and understanding of the challenges of this value chain that I think is important for us to understand when we're designing a base case model for how to build out a new energy system. The first principle here, of course, as I just mentioned, it needs to be economically viable without ongoing public dollars. I think it's very clear that we're going to need some public funding to get this value chain and put it together. But once that funding comes in, we really need to be able to stop funding, and the value chain will continue to exist and thrive. And so we're suggesting a positive, yes, it should be, if public funding should be focused on infrastructure and capital investments, and on efforts to rapidly achieve the efficiencies of scale. But we're discouraging investments in operational costs to keep the system running, because as soon as the funding stops. Obviously, the system won't run anymore if it needs public funding for operations. The second thing to do is to understand is we really must understand all the challenges and opportunities and needs of all links in this value chain. Like any chain, a value chain is only good as strong as its weakest link. But we would argue that there's the key stakeholder in this value chain are essentially highlighted in red here. We see them as, because they're the hydrogen users, and when you actually think about the flow of money, essentially these are the sectors that will pay for the entire value chain. When a trucking company buys a vehicle, they're paying essentially for the OEM production of that vehicle. When they buy fuel, they're paying for the fuel value chain in order. So what we have to do in developing a value chain, a new value chain, is to work as hard as we can to ensure that the total cost of ownership for the transportation sector, for example, or for buses, or for heat and power in that case, must be equivalent to or better than in the alternative that they're replacing. In the case of transportation, we see the market potential here, especially is in the market potential for diesel. Secondly is on the OEM vehicle companies. There is today very limited production of these vehicles. So the cost of these vehicles is very high. What we need to do is to get demand for these vehicles up to a scale where we can bring the cost for producing these vehicles down and reach near cost parity. So again, we can meet the needs, of course, for the total cost of ownership for the key stakeholders. On the fueling station side, in order to be viable without subsidies, without ongoing subsidies, fueling stations must be able to deliver in the range of 2 to 10 tons of hydrogen per day. At about, we'd estimate $4 to $8 a kilogram for heavy trucking and buses, et cetera. And in order to achieve this, we are going to need pipelines, and we'll show you some more evidence on that later. But in the interim, we may not be able to go to pipelines right away in many cases, but we have to be able to move towards pipeline distribution of gases as quick as possible. On the production side, to be viable, green hydrogen needs a low-cost power. And so figuring out where you're going to get that really low-cost electricity is critical for green hydrogen production. And blue hydrogen needs scale in the hundreds of tons of hydrogen per day in order to make cost-effectively blue hydrogen production. On the transportation and storage side, that brings this all together. Compressed and liquid hydrogen are really expensive to make, move, and store hydrogen, but they may be needed in the shorter term with smaller systems. But pipelines, to get the pipelines though, it only works with large volumes. So we have to plan that reality into the deployment strategy. Then the last two here, export market opportunities are, I've already mentioned, quite substantial. We really need a deep market understanding, engagement with export markets. And that's going to be important to think about how we could piggyback export markets. Obviously, they're going to require pipelines, and how we can actually maybe piggyback on export markets to provide also our domestic markets, something that should be considered. And heat and power use. Well, hydrogen may be the best alternative, as I've mentioned before. The costs are high relative to natural gas. So we may see, we have to think very carefully about how we deploy hydrogen into heat and power demand. Clearly, it's going to need pipeline delivery of hydrogen, but it has to be done in a sequence to keep the costs down. And finally, one of the last principles here is that in order to pull all of this together, and this is why I emphasize the importance of the value chain and the importance of doing it concentrated in certain regions of Canada, is that it's a very complex system. We're building a new value chain. So we need to focus on concentrated areas, hubs, and corridors to allow us to get to scale that will bring the cost down and the overall impact of public money up for transforming our energy system. So why have we chosen Edmonton as a place for a hydrogen hub? And this is work that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years And really Edmonton came out as the place to really get started on a large-scale hub. And this is because of the home of the Alberta Industrial Heartland. The Alberta Industrial Heartland produces approximately about 40% of all of the hydrogen produced in Alberta. And it occurs in a region here to the north and east as part of Edmonton, and to the northeast of Edmonton through Fort Saskatchewan and the number of the counties. Mayor Nachu is mayor of one of those counties, Strathcona. And in this region already we have today is a hydrogen pipeline. It belongs to Air Products. It's a 50-kilometer long pipeline. There's also 2 CO2 pipelines. These already exist today. All of them are in use today. And there are a number of different companies along this pipeline and affiliated with it, but also are in other areas in the region that are producing hydrogen. And some of that hydrogen that's being produced by 3 of the companies here is already blue hydrogen, low cost, where the carbon is being captured and put into these pipelines. And as Mayor Nachu mentioned in the introduction, in the last month or so, we've had an announcement by Suncor and ATCO for plans to put in new blue hydrogen facilities, and that in their case by 2027. And just in the last week or so, Air Products has announced a major blue hydrogen facility that they hope to bring online by 2024. These actually really will help to anchor this as a source of hydrogen that will not only be used for industrial feedstocks and to decarbonize our existing production system, but also as a fuel for an energy future. So the high-level strategy we've been developing for the Edmonton region is to basically piggyback on the industrial production that is already occurring and will may increase the industrial blue hydrogen production, pipeline it to rapidly grow hydrogen demand in transportation markets for trains, for trucks and buses, for domestic heating, industrial heating, possibly for power generation. And this same kind of infrastructure could be used to pick up green hydrogen production or other blue hydrogen production and help bring it to marketplace. We can produce this hydrogen at approximately, with carbon capture and storage, around $1.50 per kilogram. And the idea is to be able to deliver it in the $3.50 to $7 per kilogram for transportation fuels and the $2 per kilogram as in space heating. With carbon taxes going up, the price card could be even higher. The liquid hydrogen could provide, is another way of delivering that, and it could provide this and rapidly increase or demand remotely. But of course, this is going to require more subsidies because it adds significantly to the cost of the hydrogen. And we know that Edmonton has a lot of demand, potential demand areas, and we've estimated this to be demand for around 670 tons of hydrogen per day for transportation, for building heating in 1,500 tons a day plus export. The real issue then is how do we get there from where we are today? And so one of the things is really, yeah.
Hey, pop in here for a second. I'm just going to, just as you change slides here, I'm just going to flag for people that there's quite an active Q&A going on. So we are keeping track of the votes. Good questions are trickling to the top, and we'll deal with those in priority. But I'll just flag that anyone on the call here can type an answer to any question. And I see there's some, really, really good, solid answers being put into those questions. So feel free to go back and forth as participants and type in your answers into that Q&A section there as well. Thanks, Dave.
Great stuff. Thank you. So I think it's really important to understand that in the Edmonton region, low carbon hydrogen supply is not our problem. It's actually the demand and distribution that's the problem. And that's what we need to focus on within the hydrogen hub. And so, as I mentioned before, to be economically viable, each fueling station must deliver 2 to 5 tons of hydrogen a day. What that means is that if we're going to put vehicles to use this hydrogen, we're going to need, if we're going to be using personal vehicles to drive these fueling stations, we're going to need 2,500 to 6,000 personal cars. That's pretty hard to achieve, especially with one fueling station, of course. And so that's a challenge. We're going to need 80 to 200 buses. That's more feasible, especially if you're dealing with fueling stations within municipal bus fleets. We're going to need about 27 to 67 heavy trucks because they use a lot more hydrogen than a personal car, or 10 to 25 trains. One of the other things to recognize is that the OEM vehicle companies, are really running flat out right now. There's a rapidly increasing global interest in hydrogen vehicles. And that means that Alberta is actually competing with other jurisdictions around the world for OEM interest and engagements. We don't have any OEMs here now making hydrogen vehicles, so we need to bring them in from other jurisdictions. And what OEMs want is access to low cost, low carbon fuel, and they want access to vehicle buyers. On the transportation side, this is a really key component of cost. And this is a chart, this is work from 2007. The numbers are a little different today, but it's fundamentally the same principle. Is you can have hydrogen delivered as a compressed gas in the G section here. You can have it as a cryogenic liquid, a very low temperature liquid, and that's in this section here, and or in a pipeline. And the compressed gas is really good for pilots and early demos when you got really low volume. In this chart, we see the price of hydrogen in the y-axis here. And the other two axes are the amount of hydrogen flowing. These are tons per day, up to 100 tons per day, and the distance you have to move the hydrogen. So the compressed gas here is really good for low volumes, short distances, but quickly the price gets out unreasonably high. Then liquid hydrogen can take over in some cases here, and to grow, this is really good for growing small markets and maintaining, you can actually transport that a long distance, but the price is still reasonably high, and is driven up by the cost of liquefaction and moving it around. Where the sweet spot exists here is only when you get to large volumes and you can get to longer distances when you start moving hydrogen in pipelines. But we need to be talking about many tens of tons per day and hundreds of tons per day to make it work. But this is ideal. This is kind of the sweet spot for the Edmonton region if we can get to scale. So let's talk the scale of ambition for fuel hydrogen. And what I'm going to do here is in a couple charts, show you what we're thinking about in terms of heavy freight. This is Class 8 trucks. We're only looking at Class 8 trucks. I'm not looking at here buses, trains, light or medium duty vehicles, off-road vehicles, residential or space heating, or power generation. This is another, we're just focusing on one sector, Class 8 trucks. These are the kind of trucks you see driving on the major highways. They account for about 35% of diesel use in Alberta. There's 110,000 vehicles in the province, in Alberta, registered vehicles, but we've been doing quite a detailed analysis of this population. We find that about the youngest 50% of these vehicles use about 90% of the fuel. So that's actually good news for us. We don't have to change over the whole fleet. We just have to change over the younger vehicles, of course, and we can get most of the fuel use. And in our models, we've assumed a 1% growth in this sector over the next 30 years. And so what we're looking at here is what's possibly achievable. We looked at two different models, a more conservative and a more aggressive model, and for what would be needed in order to get the transition of this sector. What you see in the bottom in the dashed lines is the number of vehicles that would be sold each year of the new vehicles, of replacement vehicles. And these vehicles are kept a long time, so it takes a while to switch over the stock of vehicles and to achieve the major reductions and transformation to hydrogen as a fuel from diesel as a fuel. And what you can see here is this is the approximate line of the number of heavy duty vehicles that need to be in the fleet in order to reduce emissions by 90%. And we're talking here in the range of 55, 60, 70, 75,000 vehicles in the fleet. And that's going to take a number of years to switch that over. So what I'm really doing is the focus that we have right now is to look at the next 10 years. So I've got here in a plot 2022 to 2032, and the two different scenarios with the number of new vehicles being sold, and in the red and blue for the two different scenarios here, and how many trucks we need to see on the road by 2030 of these big trucks. And considering we have 0 on the road today, we're talking by 2030, perhaps somewhere between 3,500 of these heavy Class 8 trucks to 8,500 trucks on the road. And what this would do is increase hydrogen demand. In a profile, we're projecting by 2027, with this number of vehicles, we could have 24 to 48 tons of hydrogen per day demand. By the time we get to 2030, we're somewhere between 120 or something to 200, about 300 tons, 250 tons of hydrogen a day. But by the time we get to 2050, we're up over 2,500 tons of hydrogen per day. That is more than all of the hydrogen produced within the Edmonton region today. So when we look at this kind of energy transition, I think it's important to recognize that there are different phases. We are here now, we're just into 2021. Obviously, we need to be looking at pilots and testing. There are none of these vehicles on the road of these heavy duty trucks, for example, or even hydrogen fuel buses on the road in Canada today. So we need to do some pilot and some learning to test and learn in the real world. We then need to move to demonstrations. Once we know a vehicle works, we need to get out to be able to show it to the key stakeholders that are going to be buying these vehicles and wanting to use them, to show, to prove, to build interest and confidence in these vehicles. We need to move then into a rapid commercialization and sector to get the early adopters and the industry leaders to help them move forward, and then full up deployment that will take us so that it'll be the highly competitive choice for moving into the future. And so what I'm going to do is to look through some of each of these pilots, demonstrations, et cetera, and to give some examples of the kind of work that we're already doing or what we'd like to be doing in building out a hydrogen economy. I think one example of a pilot has been already mentioned is the AZTEC project. It's one we started with a number of different partners a couple of years ago, and it's to design and build 2 of these heavy duty trucks. These are very heavy duty. They're 63.5 ton gross weight. They're going to be on the road about a year from now in Q3 2022, running the Edmonton to Calgary return trip, 700 kilometers between refueling. And this has been funded with Emission Reductions Alberta and Natural Resources Canada. Another project that Mayor Nachu talked about is the Fort Saskatchewan Hydrogen Blending Project, an incredibly important project for a 5% blend. And hopefully that will expand quickly once they get all the details worked out. There are a number of projects that are being funded with Emission Reductions Alberta. 2 companies here have got different projects on methane pyrolysis. Converting methane to hydrogen and carbon black means you don't have to, carbon black should be easier to sequester, and there may even be a market for it in rubber tires and paints, et cetera, and perhaps other markets for carbon black in the future. And CP, we've all heard about CP's announcements in the last 3 or 4 months of them building hydrogen-powered line haul freight locomotives. These are great pilots, really important. They're in progress today. We would love to see, and we're working to try to see other pilots being brought online, like a hydrogen diesel dual fuel technology. And this is basically a retrofit of diesel engines to take somewhere between 30% to even 60% or more of the energy for fuel energy from hydrogen. We see this as an important bridge technology to really build out hydrogen demand at the fueling stations and help us to get the more aggressive curves that we've talked about on the previous charts. And there's a UK company that's already doing this, Ulemco. There's a seminar later this week with them, if anybody's interested. There's a Hydra, as a company from Vancouver that's trying to develop a similar technology. And the University of Alberta with the Koch Lab, working with Cummings, is developing a technology that we're very excited about and is very supportive of seeing it move forward. There's a wind and solar to hydrogen fueling station concept of best possibly of actually creating the wind right on the site where you need fueling stations, especially in remote areas across Canada where we need fueling stations, say on Highway 1, and where you could put wind and solar and hydrogen to a fueling station. And the Hamid Zaripur lab at the University of Calgary has been doing a lot of work in this space and is really interested in identifying industry partners to work with to try to possibly bring through some pilots for this in the next few years. There's another possibility of ammonia used for energy for remote communities, or because hydrogen is used as the main energy input to make ammonia. The ammonia can be trucked around relatively easily and stored easily. And indeed, there's a lot of technologies being developed, especially in Japan and South Korea, for converting ammonia into electricity, either through fuel cells or even converting ammonia back to hydrogen again, that could provide a transportation fuel and heat and electricity. And I point you to Gencell Energy. It's an Israeli company that you might want to look up that has an interest in sort of remote off-grid communities, and this provides an interesting decarbonization strategy. Biomass is another one for possibly for remote communities, but also even for municipal waste areas, where we can take biomass and convert it to hydrogen, but ideally couple that hydrogen to carbon capture and storage, so you actually get negative emission fuel from the hydrogen. And this technology could easily be deployed. It can be deployed in the Edmonton Municipal Waste Center, or actually in remote communities across. And there are a number of companies who are in Edmonton or in Alberta that are interested in this, and other parts of Canada. So those are the kinds of pilot projects I think would be very valuable, and we need to be moving on those quickly. And certainly, I hope we'll hear more announcements in the next few months about some of those demonstrations or pilots going forward. Now let's look at some demonstrations projects. This is more or less proven technology that needs to be brought out and introduced to companies to get them interested. So it's really about creating hands-on experience. There already is available commercially now, Toyota Mirais. And these might not be so valuable in a hydrogen economy for personally owned vehicles, but say fleets of Toyota Mirais that could be used as a taxi fleet, or as a fleet where they're driving many tens of, even 100,000 kilometers a year. You can get the hydrogen demand up and the economics to make sense. New Flyer buses are available now. Hyzon trucks, these heavy duty hydrogen fuel cell trucks, are supposed to be available later this year, and Nikola in 2022. And Hyundai trucks are being sold now in South Korea and in Europe, and we're trying to find a way of getting them moved to North America for deployment here. So to realize this, we need engaged prospective vehicle owners and users like municipalities and AMTA members and Alberta Motor Transport members that seem quite interested in these. We need somebody to run a demonstration program to actually run these, and we're working with a number of partners on this. We need access to fuel, of course, and we need the government support to help offset the higher cost of these vehicles. And of course, in Alberta, as I mentioned before, is competing with other jurisdictions for the vehicle access. Access to fuel is a really important one. And I think what's needed, especially at this demonstration stage, as we move out over the next decade or so, it's really going to be important to develop and implement some mobile fueling stations. And where we can take hydrogen, if you compress the hydrogen and move it, the fuel gets quite expensive, $20 to $25 a kilogram using this pathway here. But with liquefaction to liquid hydrogen, and the new Air Products announcement talked about making liquid hydrogen. And this is an Air Products liquid hydrogen truck. I actually used to fuel the space shuttle back here in the background. This hydrogen you can get down to perhaps in $10 to $15 per kilogram range. And the idea is even there's some mobile refuelers have been developing that are liquid hydrogen based. And so something like that could be perhaps deployed within Alberta and actually in all Western Canada to provide fuel, perhaps fuel made in the Edmonton industrial heartland could actually be provided to Western Canada to do some demonstrations and get companies interested in these vehicles as a pathway to a low carbon future. We also need to look at hydrogen and space heating. We see the Edmonton potential here for a 20% blend is like 110 tons of hydrogen per year. And this would not require any infrastructure changes within houses, et cetera, are very limited. A possibility of we need some demonstrations of hydrogen in natural gas boilers or commercial institutional buildings, water heaters, barbecues, ranges. And these, this is being done, and there's a website here that links to what's being done in other countries in this space. And of course, possibly creating new net zero buildings or communities based on low carbon hydrogen use in those buildings. We need to also look at the demonstration of hydrogen in power generation, small scale, or even gas turbines. And there's a number of companies that are now out producing hydrogen gas turbines that could be tapped and demonstrated and for larger scale expansion within Alberta, within the Edmonton industrial region, with the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB. And of course, hydrogen enabling renewables. This is quite an important area where possibility of wind and solar. If the price is high, you put it on the grid. As we deploy more wind and solar in Alberta, the price often drops for the electricity. Maybe that's a time to switch and start making hydrogen. And I think this opens up new economic opportunities for large-scale wind and solar distribution within the province, because the wind can actually be made into hydrogen, and especially if we had some other infrastructure to get that hydrogen to market, it would be, in our calculations, an economically viable solution. Finally, commercialization, about ready to wrap up. One of the things on commercialization is to really look at how do we get it so this system is deployed at scale and moves forward quickly. We know we want to make the Edmonton hub the most attractive place in North America, perhaps in the world, for commercialization of the vehicles. We need access to the low carbon hydrogen. We need pipelines for distribution and a significant scale of demand. We know where the fueling stations are. We know where the natural gas gates are for distribution, power generation opportunity, commercial institutional space heating. We even know where the discontinued natural gas pipelines could be repurposed, and the possibility of developing over the next, we would argue over the next 8 to 9 years, up to, we've estimated amounts that could be developed in demand for municipal fueling stations, for heavy truck and train refueling, for space heating, for power generation, for export to other regions and to other jurisdictions outside of this, both within Alberta and outside. And indeed, if we're actually looking at export pipelines, the limits almost does not have a limit, as noted before, in what other countries would like to import from Alberta and from Canada. So hydrogen pipeline infrastructure is essential here. It's essential, we would argue, to make the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen Hub a world-class hub. It complements and follows the compressed or liquid hydrogen, which is needed in the early stages, and actually needed to grow out and bring hydrogen to other communities that don't have the opportunities that Edmonton has. We need to target major transportation corridors. We're looking at the major corridors that exist in the province, of dark blue lines here. And we would argue that the natural gas blending could provide a really dynamic storage for the transportation demand. And we see a real synergy between hydrogen blending into natural gas and transportation fueling stations. The pipelines, we'd argue, must be open access and built for the future. They must be planning for the 2030, 2040, so they have to be overbuilt. We need to explore the repurposing of existing natural gas infrastructure, and there's a fair amount of that in the region. And public support is going to be needed to CapEx to ensure the cost-effective hydrogen supply in the early stages of commercialization. And so with these sort of guidelines, you see this is a key part of a build-out of a robust hydrogen economy within the Edmonton region. We feel that by doing these other ones, pilots, demonstration, commercialization, we can rapidly get to deployment. We're hoping to see commercial full deployment without ongoing public subsidies very rapidly in this region, as if we put in the commercialization stages in the early part. So finally, just to talk on high levels of some key principles for success in building a new hydrogen value chain. And let me just, I skipped this one. I'm going to jump here. This is the wrong one. First of all, is we got to understand the level of ambition. We need a quantitative understanding of the level of ambition with a credible and compelling transition pathway. Second is we need a balance of control on this, to make sure that we build a new value chain with a balance of control so that no entity should be able to exercise undue control over the supply and demand. It has to be a balanced control over the value chain. There has to also be a balance of risk and benefit so that all value chain participants must receive sufficient benefit for them to stay engaged. It needs to be economically viable without ongoing public investment. So we see CapEx preferred to OpEx, and carbon pricing is important, but also support getting to scale so the costs can then decrease. Regional fit is important. We have to fit these hydrogen hubs to their unique characteristics. And we're certainly doing that in the Edmonton region, but we see opportunities in other parts of Canada, looking at supply, demand, delivery, and workforce. Transparency is really important. What is the common understanding so there is a common understanding among value chain participants and appropriate regulatory environment, and the certainty of greenhouse gas reductions have to be built in. And finally, we need to harness public sector competitiveness. And Mark Lee Wilson from the Transition Accelerator is going to be launching this within the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen HUB. Just started it. In many ways, we've been doing market sounding for the last couple of years, but I think we want to do this a much more formal process of really engaging industry, engaging the various key players in the region and in the province and hopefully this will lead to calls for proposals from governments to invest in projects that will move us forward quickly. So in conclusion, zero emission hydrogen production, use and export represents a huge opportunity for Canada. As a major producer of hydrogen today, the Edmonton Regional Hydrogen HUB is ideally poised to lead, but we need a coordinated value chain to guide both policies and the allocation of public and private dollars. And we need a similar value chain approach, I would say, that we're trying to develop here, could be used by virtually all new hubs to ensure that we create an economically viable system that remains when the public funding stops. Thank you very much. Very happy to entertain questions, discussion.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Maybe I'll just give you a second to catch your breath before we put you to work answering questions. So just so you know, Dave, you probably haven't been monitoring, but we've got 62 questions that are being asked.
Okay.
So we might contemplate actually having another webinar in the not too distant future because we're not going to be able to now get through the now 63 questions. So I've just got one comment here, and that is this notion of public investment. The reality is there is a remarkable amount of money on the table. So the government of Canada has $8 billion with something called their Net Zero Accelerator Fund. They've got an additional $1.5 billion with their Zero Emission Fuel Fund, and there's other pots of money at the federal level and the provincial level as well. So as much as anything, this strategy here that Dave laid out in terms of the base case that will be continued to be refined and calibrated with market sounding into industry and others, the intent here is to frankly provide a straw dog blueprint that the private sector can use to tailor their project development and tailor their business strategies, and the public sector can use to make the most cogent strategic funding decisions so that public dollars are invested in the value chain, in places along the value chain where it's most difficult. Why would the public sector invest in the places along the value chain where you have the least number of barriers? If you actually want a value chain, it's the public dollars that need to flow to the places where there are barriers and the economics are the most difficult. And often, Dave, as you pointed out, that's the demand side, not the production side. So in any event, I'm going to go to the top of the question list here and rattle off one. So this one, Dave, this one got 39 votes. So the question is, how realistic is the scenario of using ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen worldwide or in Canada? And I'll just say this was asked earlier in your presentation, and I think you filled some of that in later in your talk, but maybe take a crack at that. How realistic is ammonia as a carrier?
I think actually ammonia is a fantastic carrier, especially for overseas. It's as far as I don't see ammonia as being realistic on a vehicle as a fuel for thousands or tens of hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Partly because it's a pretty toxic substance, and one needs to. It's an inhalation problem. You inhale it, you don't usually live very long. So it is. It's a problem gas, if you like. But though I do think we've learned how to handle ammonia as a fertilizer, and there's very few accidents occur with ammonia, and I think it could actually be extremely valuable for remote communities, maybe First Nation communities, opportunities for a low carbon alternative for them. It can be moved by truck quite easily or by train. I think putting it in a pipeline is being talked about by some countries. There's a challenge, of course, with pipeline leaks. It would do a lot of environmental damage if leaked. So I think my preference would be make ammonia in the right where you need it for export to Japan and South Korea. There's a lot of interest there in importing ammonia as essentially a hydrogen carrier. And I think that opportunity is huge.
Great. I'm actually going to flop back and forth, some high voted questions and some low ones that I think are important. I'll just remind everyone that this recording and Dave's deck are going to be available on the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB website and the Transition Accelerator website. And frankly, if you want to keep up to date on new reports and next steps in the whole HUB process, follow the HUB's Twitter account or the Transition Accelerator's Twitter account or LinkedIn account. Dave, here's one. Someone wanted more information on the concept of using renewables, wind or solar, to create hydrogen for a remote or for a fueling station. Can you comment on that?
Sure. This is work that we've been doing as one of the projects within the Transition Accelerator with Dr. Zaripour's an electrical engineer at the University of Calgary. And the analysis have been quite interesting, is that, somewhere between, well, we've been saying, well, we need about 2 tons of hydrogen a day at a fueling station. How many wind turbines and solar panels do we need? And what's the optimal combination of wind turbines, solar panels, and electrolyzer size to give us 2 tons of hydrogen a day? And the real problem is what do you do when the wind doesn't blow in the middle of winter? So the sun's not really there. And in that case, we looked at importing hydrogen and paying a premium for importing it. And the analysis, and we'll hopefully have a report out in a few months on this, but the analysis suggests that this actually could be a viable alternative. But again, it needs to have, we work closely with industry, and we need to be following it up. Something at 10 megawatts of, say around 10 megawatts of wind and 8 to 10 megawatts of solar could provide a pretty viable hydrogen fueling station, a remote one at about 2 tons a day.
Thanks. And so again, I'll just flag, that's one of the analysis that Dave is doing inside of the hub. And so a report should be public on that on 2 or 3 months. So again, follow the hub Twitter account or the accelerator for that. Dave, there's a fair bit of chatter back and forth in the chat box, but also the Q's and A's on this sort of debate around upgrading natural gas to make hydrogen or electrolyzing water.
Right.
And there's a bit of a debate around, what is the actual water requirements
right.
For making electrolytic hydrogen, and how do they compare to the water requirements for upgrading natural gas? So any just general comments on that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, when you're getting all of the hydrogen from electrolysis from water, you're going to need more water for electrolytic hydrogen production per unit of hydrogen than you would if you're going to get about half of your hydrogen from water and half from natural gas when you use steam methane reforming. And if you use methane pyrolysis, theoretically, you don't use any water because you're getting all of the hydrogen from the methane, the CH4, if you like, you're cracking it into hydrogen and carbon. There is a lot of work that's been done, even on electrolysis, that certainly water demand is going to be substantial, but the cost and the overall economics of it, and there's some work by Adnan Khan, who's one of our works within the Transition Accelerator, that has looked at what is the economics of taking salty water and upgrading it to higher water that could be used in an electrolyzer. And it's about 5%, according to the work that he's been doing, of 5% of the cost. So it's not a deal breaker. And I think that we are going to have to solve the water problem where, as well. For sure, it is an issue, but I don't think it's. I don't think the high water demand on electrolysis doesn't mean that electrolysis can't be valuable in certain areas. And I think it all has to be weighed into the overall decision about how best to make hydrogen.
Thanks. I'm going to flag for people that a couple of HUB staff are actually taking quite an active role in answering the questions on the online. So if you see Mark Lee Wilson or Jacob Lamb or Chris Bailey, those are actually HUB personnel giving you essentially HUB answers. So thank you folks for that. Dave, what about safety concerns? So just generically, people sometimes have a preconceived notion of the safety of hydrogen compared to other fuels or fuel carriers. Any comments on safety?
I guess when it comes to a transportation fuel, I see it, the way I look at it is hydrogen is actually probably safer than gasoline or diesel. If there's the container that holds it, a compressed tank holds it on a vehicle, is much more robust, and it can withstand shotgun or guns blasts and everything else dropping from high distances. It's very high pressure, high resilient tank. If it does leak, hydrogen diffuses very quickly. It doesn't pool under a vehicle and potentially catch fire and set the vehicle on fire. It'll be more like a torch going off if it was to catch fire. But mostly it would be a leak, and the hydrogen would diffuse very, very quickly. So I think most of the analysis is that it's probably safer. The reality is that we carry around a lot of dangerous liquids right now. We know how to do it. We have rules around it. And the rules around hydrogen in the hydrogen economy are going to be more rigorous today than when we started using gasoline and diesel 100 years ago. I think if you just think about if somebody came forward with the idea of a gas station, the way our gas stations work today, where you've got a combustible explosive liquid, and you could just go up to, you put your credit card in the pump and you pull it out and you can squirt it and gasoline just pours out, right?
No training.
With no training, right? I mean, this is, we're going to, the hydrogen is going to be safer.
David, I've just riff on that. We actually did a diagnostic of every energy transition since we had energy. And there's always public concern about every single transition, right back, when we talked about natural gas from candles and on and on and on. And the reality is that every one of those transitions is not absolutely risk-free, and there's not absolutely incident-free, but there has been an acceptable level of risk management because of technology, codes and standards, and training. And our thinking is it's exactly the same here. And the reality is that there's already over 50% hydrogen in natural gas systems around the world right now. So it's not as if we can't do it. I mean, all the technology exists to do it. It's just, how can we make, under economic conditions, can we make this transition in Canada? So, Dave, there's one here. Quick comments on sort of the effectiveness differences between an electric vehicle, like an EV transportation platform, versus a hydrogen platform. What types, where would those two transportation platforms be more or less amenable? Are they competing?
Well, certainly, I mean, we've talked about two types of hydrogen being used in vehicles, hydrogen diesel dual fuel. I would see it as probably an interim solution, as a bridge technology that really helps to build out the hydrogen infrastructure and demand to get us to scale. I think the real place we want to go is to hydrogen fuel cell electric. These are electric vehicles just as a battery electric vehicles, just that they have and many of them are used, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are kind of range extenders. So they're really battery electric vehicles where the hydrogen fuel cell basically charges your batteries as you drive. And they give not only a range extension, so you don't have to, but also a rapid, they essentially, it's refueling all the time. So you save, for commercial vehicles, you don't want to be sitting around for 4 or 5 hours recharging, especially in the middle of a workday, or even 1 hour, right? You just want to be rapid refueling and back on the road. So in terms of, there's a role for both. And a lot of what we're doing in working with municipalities, for example, on trying to look at where the role of our hydrogen and bus fleets, is working with companies like Zen Clean Energy Solutions that have been doing analysis of where the bus fleets are and where battery electric buses make the most sense, usually on the smaller buses on shorter routes, and where the hydrogen fuel cell buses, longer routes, larger buses, where the battery electric decision just doesn't work very well. You can't store enough energy on the bus. You need longer distances, and you need the buses running, for example, 16 hours a day or 18 hours a day, and you just don't have time to recharge and refuel. And also the infrastructure cost of refueling 1,000 or hundreds of buses in one location is a real challenge. So all of these go into the decision. Certainly in working with the heavy freight sector, that we've been with the Alberta Motor Transport Association, the message we're getting is very strong. They need heavy loads, long distance transport, and most battery electric models just can't deliver that and are not likely to deliver the kind of the kind of fit for service that is needed by these vehicles. So that's where the hydrogen electric goes, and that's the market we're targeting.
Dave, there's a question around the potential to use Edmonton Region Transit as a way to sort of build demand.
What a brilliant idea. So, no, I think Edmonton, in fact, I can say Edmonton and Strathcona, and, we've been in many discussions with them. There's a lot of interest within both of those. I don't think they mind us saying a lot of interest to test out, to demonstrate and try out hydrogen fuel cell buses. And we hope that something will happen in that space. We've been talking with the city of Calgary and the city of Banff Valley that are also interested in demonstrating this. And one of the things we've been working with these groups to try to make it possible to give them hands-on experience, increase the confidence that they have that this new technology is going to put them on a transition pathway to net zero that will basically help them meet the needs of the clients. And I would say that all of the companies that we've been dealing with, all of the municipal agencies, and I know other municipalities across Canada, Winnipeg, et cetera, are also very interested in trying out and demonstrating these new buses.
I mean, let's build on that a little bit. Like for me, we think of transition as technical, where there's a policy in place or there's some type of regulation or incentive, and people do economic analysis and then they do some engineering, and that's what a transition is. The reality is that it's people that make decisions inside of government, inside of companies, individual consumers make a consumer choice. And I think forever we have underestimated really the importance of individual decisions and sort of psychological preferences and comfort levels and risk tolerances and how organizations and people make decisions. So it's very much something that inside the Edmonton Hub that we're trying to do. So when we talk about sort of demonstration projects, Dave's been very clear. For many of those, there's commercial offerings. I mean, you can buy a hydrogen fuel cell bus right now off the rack. But the reality is that transit systems don't know much about hydrogen fuel cell buses and what are the mechanical upkeep requirements and so on. So the concept of a transition is not just about engineering and economics. It's about how people make decisions. And that's a fundamental thread through everything that Dave is building out of this base case. I'm going to go back to the questions here. And there's one on the government of Alberta's carbon storage 10-year information letter number 19, 2021. And I'll summarize it very quickly here. This concept of carbon capture and storage is key to, a blue hydrogen. So the government has been working on policy, and the policy so far is that they will have sort of regional spatial hubs, or under a competitive process, a company will get the rights to sequester carbon, store carbon in that area. So there's no question that's absolutely important for building out a blue hydrogen economy. If sequestration is storage is important, and this is the policy around storage. Dave, any other comments from you other than that? I mean, that's being developed as we speak right now, and I think everyone understands that it's critical, including the government. We know that there's very, very good people from the government of Alberta working on this, as well as their hydrogen strategy for Alberta. So they're on it. If anyone's concerned that they don't know the issue or they're not working hard at it, that's not the case. But Dave, any other comments?
No, I would just agree with your comments. It's incredibly important if we're going to need carbon capture and storage space. And I think one of the main take-home messages, we gotta really understand our level of ambition, because our level of ambition will determine how much hydrogen we're going to need to produce in order to meet the needs, which is going to define how much carbon we're going to need to capture and sequester. And I think it's important to make sure that we, many of these things, it take many years in order to build. You have to build a pipeline. You got to do the studies on it. We've got to put the infrastructure in place in order to be able to achieve that goal. So we need to define our level of ambition. And I think a lot of the initial blue hydrogen that will be produced in the next few years will be used as an industrial feedstock to decarbonize our existing processes. But what we're hoping to see is a very rapidly increasing demand for blue hydrogen, which will also increase the demand for more carbon capture and storage in the fuel market, and understanding the combination of those and making sure that we've got the infrastructure and the policies in place ahead of time is going to be important.
Great. Here's one that I think I can answer actually, and that is a question around the notion of training needs. So, hydrogen is a different kind of substance that needs different engineering solutions and safety solutions for companies and so on. So what the hub is doing right now, and again, we're only 2 months old, but, really being driven hard by those 3 levels of government and their elected officials, we're doing a diagnostic of the concept of training and trading needs. And we're about to launch a webinar series for the hub, where quite frequently, maybe every 3 or 4 weeks, we would bring in an external speaker on these absolutely core topics so that we can learn from other jurisdictions. And I'll just give an advertisement. The first one that we're planning date hasn't been booked yet, is the hydrogen backbone project for Europe. So this is 23 gas companies in Europe that have plans to create, so far, 40,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline, 2/3 of that repurposed natural gas pipeline. Because what they want to do is they want to build the system they need for 2050 that will fit into a net zero world and allow them to have hydrogen play a key role in that. So that's one. The second one that we're looking at is there's a training program that we're quite smitten with in Europe, to bring a representative from that training program to talk about training. So training is something the hub's going to wrap its mind around for sure. Dave, back to you. This is sort of on the surface, an easy one, but pretty complicated. So there's a question: what's the minimum viable size for a hydrogen hub in terms of tons per day production?
Geez,
I thought I'd get that reaction. Yeah, that's
right. It's a tough one. I think it's all. I guess the metric that I've been using is when the public funding stops, you want it to keep going, right? That's the metric, right? If it can't reach that bar, now obviously that's not going to happen in the first 6 months. Well, hopefully the public funding won't stop 6 months after it starts, right? But within a reasonable time frame for public investment, and that has to be part of the hub planning, is how are you going to get to basically create an economically viable system. Now that system, I think the hydrogen could come from many. It could be made locally initially through wind and turbines and using grid electricity that is low carbon, and to get demand started and growing. But then actually the longer term plan could be to bring a pipeline in, or to set up a blue hydrogen facility that actually is producing blue hydrogen and sequestering carbon, or to piggyback on, if methane pyrolysis actually turns out to be a technology that can really be proven to work at scale, then it opens up a lot of opportunities for some economically viable hubs that are a bit smaller.
Great. So Dave, we're up to 77 questions now, and I can tell what's happening. There's so many questions, people are losing track on them, including, and some great questions down at the bottom aren't getting votes. I think if they came in earlier, they would have. So I'm going to cherry pick some of those. But in the meantime, here's a question. Considering carbon storage is so important to creating a blue hydrogen or upgrading natural gas, what is the state of storage? Meaning, what's our capacity? I mean, is there enough carbon capture capacity to keep this industry going for how long?
Yeah, no, I wish if Richard Harris was, well, he may be on the call, but I would ask him to answer that. We have a report coming out. Richard Harris has been working with Sean McCoy and myself to do an analysis of what the potential is within the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. I can say it's very large. There's a lot of more details. I think we certainly have in the range, of for many decades. There's no problem for the next, any carbon that we produce in the next 10 to 20 years, we got lots of capacity to sequester it. Certainly many tens of millions of tons per year could be sequestered. We have the potential to do that. The question is how big the pool or the resource is. Theoretically, it's huge, very large, but whether it's economically viable for all of it, how much is economically viable. And I think that's one of the recommendations that that's coming out of the report that Richard Harris has been writing, is that what we need to do is to really start doing an analysis of what is the size of the resource and do some test studies. And that has to be done. But it's not going to hold us up in moving forward on carbon capture storage, especially if we align it with the new policies that are being brought forward.
So Richard Harris and Sean McCoy, two of the key thinkers on this topic in Alberta. Sean McCoy, I'll just flag here as a Transition Accelerator Fellow, so we'll brag about that. But again, a report coming out that will put some numbers around this, that will quantify it. So again, follow the hub on Twitter, or follow the accelerator on our Twitter or LinkedIn, and you'll stay right up to speed about when those reports are coming out. And we're going to hold information sessions on those. So we'll hold webinars like this to explain those reports in detail for sure. Dave, back to the questions here. This is one that frankly I think should have got more votes, but so I'm going to cherry pick it. It's this notion of, we talk mostly about blue hydrogen for obvious reasons in Edmonton, but Alberta's got a lot of renewable potential as well. So someone brought up this idea of having a solar farm in one place and green hydrogen plant next to that, and having a buyer then in Edmonton. But anyway, maybe it's a commentary on Alberta's green potential and how that could fit into the mix in terms of costs.
Well, and I think we have a study, and there's another project that we've got going within the accelerator that Leonard Olian's been leading. And Leonard's a PhD student in the mathematics department, but he's been looking at a techno-economic analysis where we're looking at large scale deployment of wind and solar in southern Alberta in the terms of thousands of megawatts of deployment, which is this kind of scale that renewables are being built now in Alberta. And but instead of putting all that electricity on the grid, when the price is high, you basically put it on the grid when the price of electricity is high, but the price of electricity drops because you've got an oversupply of electricity. It's a windy day and sunny day. Then what you do is make hydrogen, and where the market potential, what's the economics? We see some. We've been playing with some models that suggest there's a very significant demand for hydrogen in California, and there is a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline that comes from right through the Pincher Creek area, goes right past Pincher Creek and ends up in California. And there is a possibility of putting hydrogen into that pipeline and then pulling it back out at the other end. And I think there's some interesting analysis of whether that's a feasible model, or maybe we need a second pipeline that's just pure hydrogen. California has expressed a strong desire for green hydrogen and is willing, rather than even blue, and is willing to pay a premium for it. And so I think there's some interesting export opportunities there. But I could also say that another possibility is move that hydrogen north. Calgary needs a hydrogen supply. There are not as really good hydrogen supply in the Calgary region from industrial blue hydrogen. And so maybe there's an opportunity there as well.
Great. Here's one that frankly is a lob ball. No one would know that. And it's the concept of hydrogen. Two-part question, Dave. Hydrogen for the aviation sector. So many big companies have come out with a net zero aspiration, zero emissions by 2035 or so on, Boeing and Airbus. So any thoughts of hydrogen as a source fuel for aviation? But the real question here is, another one is, what about getting hydrogen to the airport, the Edmonton International Airport, to be able to decarbonize their ground fleets and so on? And would they be interested in that?
Well, that is essentially, and I'm afraid I skipped by that in the presentation I was giving. It's a key part of Mark Lee Wilson's work on developing a strategy, is to get the pipelines down. The first pipeline we see as being necessary is to bring hydrogen down on a diagonal and then down to the airport region. We see large potential markets for hydrogen, both at the airport itself, in terms of the land vehicles, and the Edmonton Industrial Airport has been a very eager collaborator on this. But also that is, the airport marks the north end of Highway 2. There are 5,000 heavy trucks a day move on Highway 2. So even a few hundred of those trucks being switched to hydrogen would make an economically viable fueling station near the Edmonton Airport. And so we see that as a huge opportunity. In terms of the airport itself, I think the low-hanging fruit, and this is being discussed at a number of airports around the world, is to switch the ground fleets to hydrogen. It's a number of the ground fleets to hydrogen, and then create a hydrogen fuel capability at the airport. And then in the future, obviously, if you've got a number of airports that have hydrogen, one can start to look at hydrogen fueled airplanes that would fly between those airports because they got fueling available at both ends. And certainly a number of the companies, you can type in hydrogen powered airplanes or jets. And there are a number of companies working on that now, and some prototypes are being built.
All right, Dave, it's 12:28, so we've got 2 more minutes. Certainly time for one more question. I'll paraphrase and join together several questions. And the story goes something like this. The concept of getting to a self-sustaining hydrogen economy is all about scale. Intricately linked to that concept of scale is what technology to use to move hydrogen around the landscape. And pipelines is the most efficient way to ship energy, usually, almost regardless of what's inside it. And yet we know that most of our pipelines today are not perfectly suited by any means to transport hydrogen. Any comments on the concept of retrofitting pipelines or the challenges around that?
So, certainly there's a lot of interest in that. There's a number of companies that are doing it. And I think I saw some comments I would point you to some of the comments that have been from Chris Bailey and others. But certainly many of the pipeline companies that we've been talking to are studying this very carefully. There are a lot of materials. We know how to pipeline hydrogen. We're doing it now. There's a 50-kilometer pipeline in Edmonton now and a 30-kilometer pipeline in Sarnia, Ontario, that is moving hydrogen. So we know how to do it. The question is how do we retrofit a pipeline with new ceramic materials or others that could go on the inside that would actually be able to provide a way of refurbishing the pipeline. And I think there's a number of companies I know that are already working on this in Alberta and around the world. So I think that's not a rocket science, but it is an important bit of technology that needs to be brought to bear.
It's rocket fuel, not rocket science.
Yeah, exactly.
Folks, that brings us to the end here. Dave, thanks. That was sort of a marathon session, put you on the spot for the whole time. I'm going to maybe just sum up here, this concept of a base case. The principles at the end of Dave's deck, I think, are really important. So, collectively, we have to decide, what are we trying to accomplish here by when? There's two ways of advancing these types of changes in an economy. One is set some parameters and then have people decide what next steps they want to take. Well, yeah. What we're saying, and what Dave's number one principle here is, let's define what we want to accomplish in the future. What do we want this to look like at 2030, 2035, 2040? and let's build a stepwise pathway to get there. Or else, because if you take the other approach, just let things go step by step, you don't know where you're going to end up. What Dave wants to do is let's define where we want to end up in this really, really positive future, not just economically, but environmentally. So thanks very much, everyone. One last plug. We love feedback about this webinar. So if you go to the Edmonton Region Hydrogen HUB website, there is a contact us form. There's not an individual's email address there, it's generic, but we have a service standard of replying back within 48 hours to everyone that sends in communication. So we'd love to hear from you. We would love to hear suggestions for our webinar series that we'll be launching shortly in terms of big strategic topics that we all need to understand and think about. Again, follow us, and we will be putting out shortly sort of the next steps in terms of this concept of market sounding and how you can plug in and feed into and comment on this generic base case model that's being developed. So with that, we're a couple of minutes over, but thanks to those that stayed right to the end, and really appreciate it, Dave. That was good stuff.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yes,
Thank
thanks.
you, Mayor.
Have a great day.